Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Analytic Stories. I'm happy to have my colleague and friend, Nick Hara, with us today. Nick, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
All right. So let me tell you a little bit about Nick. He's got some real interesting background and really interesting work right now. So Nick is the data director for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for Congress campaign. So you probably all know her as AOC, because that's a little easier to say. And his focus is on understanding the spread of disinformation on social media. And I think we've all seen a lot of that over the last few years. So certainly that's an interesting area to be focused on at this time. And Nick's got a background in political economy and conflict resolution. So he's coming at working with data more from a, say, liberal arts aspect than maybe an IT or engineering or business aspect, which, I think is always interesting to have those different points of views. And he's been working in the field since 2013, so really kind of when it was just starting to explode. And he's worked in fields from humanitarian aid to international development, finance. And this is my favorite one, pressed wood construction products. You don't see that one very often. So I definitely want you to tell us about that quickly before we jump into the meat of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll just be a little brief about it. Is, when you're first starting out doing sales consulting, which is what I was doing at Tableau, they kind of just give you the accounts that are important, but fall into more of a miscellaneous bin. And pressed wood products was one of these companies. Lots of construction materials, things like that. And the reason that I bring it up is because it was one of those things where I had no idea what it was, really. I don't have much of a construction background, don't know much of anything about it, had to learn about them really fast. But they invited us out to one of their offices in the middle of North Carolina. And the reason I bring it up is because I have never seen people more enthusiastic about essentially taking, a log of wood, chipping it into something, and then pressing it and creating plywood products for construction. And they walked me all through their office, showed me literally every product they have in their line, and were every step of the way just like bright smiles on their faces, like, look at this thing that we're doing, it's so incredible, and like this is going to be a really easy, cheap way to create all of these homes, but they're going to be really high quality. And I was blown away by by the enthusiasm of it. So I always want to mention companies that I found were or cultures that I found were very enthusiastic about what they do, even if it's something that I don't necessarily relate to.
Nice. So did they take you into the company store to buy some things to take home with you?
They actually sent me home with a roll of this super sticky, super stretchy tape that they had been working on as a product. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Didn't know what to do with it, but it was really cool.
I'm sure one day you'll find a use for it.
I think I actually ended up giving it to my dad, who used it in his Airstream trailer that he restored.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Good. Well, there'll always be a memory to talk about when you're in the trailer.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can point to the tape.
Yeah.
That's a cool story, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Enthusiasm seems to be in short supply in general these days about work, but you don't see it in the workplace like that very often. So
yeah, absolutely.
It's a good change. Cool. Anything you want to say quickly about your work, or?
Yeah. I'll keep it brief here. One, Lee, I found myself just funny when you were introducing how slightly nervous I was. I'm just like excited to be on your podcast. So even though this is for the viewers at home, take two for us, just because we weren't able to do the first one. But just a little brief word about my work is that we're focused really on right now how to integrate data into our policy platforms, and how to create sort of positive communities that are looking at change, not just from sort of the holistic, sustainable Green New Deal perspective, but also from sort of that positive place of like how do we make data an integral component of what we're doing. So we're going to talk, I think, a lot about other topics today, but I do find that what we're doing right now is really great stuff, and it's personally for me very rewarding.
Yeah, especially after what the president talked about the other night in terms of his plans around infrastructure and green economy and
oh yeah, absolutely,
support, and all those things. So it should be real interesting for you.
Yeah, it is. I wish I could talk more about it, but yeah, there's some very interesting stuff from our side, and we're pretty enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment just for everybody who's listening, just so you know, we're not going to be talking about anything specific about Nick's work because of the sensitivity to things around, the campaign and the policies and things like that. But we're definitely going to pick his brain on some good stuff. All right, so let's jump in here. And I already mentioned at the beginning that you've worked with a lot of different customers over the years, which I think always makes for interesting work. And I'm guessing you've seen a lot of success and a lot of failure, with that. So, can you tell us about one thing where you advised customers that, based on your experience, you knew would help them avoid a lot of pain and struggles, but they didn't listen to you for some reason? So, what was that advice you gave them, and why do you think they didn't take you up on it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen over the years with different customers is something that I think we've actually already touched on, which is cultural issues. And there was an organization I was working with, humanitarian organization, that really struggled to move away from a very top-down approach toward the way that they did their administration. And this particular organization, they kept pulling me in saying, hey, let's talk about how we can sort of create a culture of analytics. What would that look like? What would that look like? And the advice I kept giving them was, it's really about putting it in the hands, the tools that people need, the training that people need, into the hands of the people that are doing the work, right? It's about decentralizing a lot of that data infrastructure. That doesn't mean that you don't have control. Obviously, there's different layers of that control. But that you fundamentally believe that your workers are smart and that they are able to do the work that is important to them. Yeah. They really struggled with that. They were just not able to, I think, put their head around the fact that that was also a shift in some of the roles that they were occupying and what that meant from an infrastructure perspective. And so I would say that when 2020 hit last year, they were an organization that would have been really well positioned to make a huge difference, but instead kind of ended up taking a back seat in a lot of ways in some of the major areas. And it was unfortunate to see. Whereas just very briefly, there was another organization working in a very similar field, doing very similar work that we did work with. And when I came in and started talking to them, they had already committed to that level of training and infrastructure buildup and decentralization, really building on data literacy, data skills, all of those sorts of things. And so they were already building programs for training their staff and making sure that that the knowledge and tools were in the hands of the people that were doing the work. So for us, it was a much easier conversation. We were also much more enthusiastic about offering the products that we had available to them to help with that sort of self-service analysis. And during the pandemic, they succeeded.
Yeah, it's because it's almost like the same old story that a lot of the problems that people face when you really comes down to the impact is more the people side of things than
Mm-hmm.
the technical hurdles. The technical hurdles are always there, but those seem to be areas that you can deal with.
Yeah.
And the people stuff gets in the way. And I love the thing you mentioned too about control. I've always thought that was interesting because I've always felt like people are concerned with control as an idea, but it's really a myth
Mm-hmm.
that they think they have control, but they really don't. I mean, when you always think about these models where, oh, we're going to restrict people, we're going to limit their access, but then you let them do things like download the data, or
Right.
well, we're only going to give you the data, and then they just do whatever they want with it, or things like that. So I think it's an illusion that they've painted for themselves over the years, and I think control is a fear factor too. Like, well, if we lose control, we lose power,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever that means to an organization. And I think it's maybe a mindset issue overall that, if you're thinking that way, you're not thinking about the customer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the harder thing too, is, people, we're customer centric. But when you think that way about control and limitations, it's like, no, if you thought about what's good for the customer, you probably would let things loosen up, not in a way that was irresponsible, but you'd figure out how to do it. So,
yeah. I mean, one thing I say a lot is that usually your data issues are communication issues. And when you start integrating certain types of tools like Tableau, where I used to work, and other sorts of self-service analysis tools, your data problems are just communication problems, and they're highlighted and they come to the fore.
Yeah.
When people start getting that power, right? When people start getting that ability to start answering their own questions, it becomes pretty obvious that as much as you may have had, say, a centralized data store, everybody downloading things onto Excel means that all of your analysis now is coming out of Excel.
Right.
So, and that's the thing that I used to say a lot to people is like, first you need to work on your communication issues, because you can throw any product in there and you're never going to fix your communication problems.
And right. And it's not just limited to this area, right? I think everything always boils down to, I shouldn't say everything, but many issues boil down to communication, right? Even just like, I thought you meant this, and no, I meant that. And when it comes to data, there's bigger issues too, right? Because if people process the data differently, or they're getting data from different places, that just accelerates and makes the problem even worse than it might have been known. And if the data has been hiding in the background and people didn't have access to it, then all this stuff, the data is still there, and whoever is using it might be using it in a way that's either wrong or not efficient, or maybe the data was wrong and it wasn't even apparent. So, all of these things about control, and I think just whether it's communication, trust, lack of thinking that people can handle it the right way, that one always makes me, feel a little bit sarcastic about when someone in an organization says, we don't trust that person or that group to use the data the right way. I'm like, that's a huge issue to make a statement like that, but you hear it all the time.
Yeah. Well, and it comes down to something that I always heard a lot was like, people are smart.
Right.
And if you're not going to like establish enough trust to like get to that point where people are smart, then your organization is going to have a lot of problems with adoption or just even using data in a meaningful context. Yeah.
That's a huge conversation we could have for a whole hour about trust in people, and what does it mean when someone says, they're smart, and are they just saying it, or do they really believe it? But then they're not able to translate that into their behavior. They may be saying it completely in good faith, but then their actions don't reflect what the words are, and how that becomes something that they're actually able to use that in the organization. And so actually, I think that's a good lead into another question I wanted to touch on. So you mentioned that you've spent a couple of years at you spent more than a couple of years at Tableau, and you switched from working, with all those companies you mentioned, and you'd worked with some nonprofits. You worked with the United Nations, and I know, that you were enthusiastic and you loved all that work that you did. So if you can think about all the kind of different groups you worked with, and I think they're varied enough that, can you think about any way that you kind of had recommended things that you should do, and the way you work with those customers where you saw some areas where they were uncomfortable in a similar way? We talked about some issues already, maybe that come up. So what was it that made them uncomfortable about making some of the changes that you brought up around working with data and information? And how were some of those groups able to move forward or not?
Yeah, I mean, I've already hinted a little bit at I think an organization that very common problem, right? Communication issues, the inability, I think, to sort of let go of some of the perceived control. And I think that's a bit of what we're talking about, right? Is perceived control as opposed to, I think, actual control. Mm-hmm. In order to do that adoption. But then I talked a little bit about another organization that very much did step in and start looking at that. And part of it was that, interestingly, it's a top-down leadership sort of approach where you say, we are going to do this. This is how the organization is running. And it made my job a lot easier, because when we were having conversations where we would come in and say, here are the things that we think would make you successful as an organization, and here are the areas where we see hurdles. And again, most of the hurdles really boiled down to communication issues, trust issues, access issues, right? Here's what you need to do to get over them. The way that we had those conversations with those organizations, and I'm thinking of about 3 organizations right now, where it was very different, ultimately came down to a level of trust with their staff, right? And so when I had conversations at every level, down at the level of the analyst, all the way up to the level of a director or a senior director running a program, it was much easier to talk about what analysis, data, and making data-driven decisions could bring to the table, than an organization that didn't have that multi-layered trust. And so it meant that often those conversations about, what are we doing? How are we doing this? Were actually driven often by the organization itself. I'm not an expert on organizational change or management or organization, right? I can't do any of those things. So certainly, when you had groups that were enthusiastic about integrating not just data, but ultimately change into how they did things, that is where I saw successful deployments and using just data in an everyday context.
Yeah. So why do you we both have mentioned this idea of trust. Why do you think, and did you see anything happen in particular that, around data and why it became, did you see it as issues that had been there, or did the fact about the conversation about working with data in these new ways, whether it was, exposing problems, right? Because things that were not seen before because of the way the data was used or not available in general, right? Maybe it just was hard to get to, or these kind of more personal, I don't say personal, but like maybe hierarchical, like, well, we don't trust those people below us to work with the data. How do you see it? Like caused by the data, or it was kind of already intrinsic in these companies, and it was just not going to change because of the data?
I don't want to say that nothing was going to change ever, right? It's a matter of time before the change happens, right? And it's either internally driven, or it's externally driven. You have to change. But I'm thinking specifically of one organization I worked with, where it was again another humanitarian organization, and what happened for them was we started with small conversations, right? And it was with, I think, just an analyst who happened to have a lot of access to the data. And so there was a lot of trust already with that person. They were sort of seen as an advocate for, just general process change. And there were a couple of moments where in the process of in Tableau, and I think a lot of tech companies, you just do a standard demo, right? But what we actually did was we pulled up some of their data that they had, and it was completely at that point, like, I didn't know anything about the data. We just pulled it up, took a look at it, and in the process of loading it up, lucky thing was it was just a simple Excel file with some expenses on it, I believe, just some expenditures, and all we did was just simple bar charts, just some quick, looking around in it. And I'm sorry, some of the details of this meeting are actually coming back to me now a little more. It was actually a meeting where one of the directors was in there with us, and actually it was like his whole department, but he was just enthusiastic about it. And he was like, "Come on in," and I did my standard demo. It was okay. I was never really great at doing demos, but then we loaded up this data, and the entire group started asking questions, just general questions like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And that's really where it started to shift, right? Where I think, obviously, the thing from a sales perspective is you want them to buy the product. But what started to shift for them that was a little bit interesting was they started realizing that, we can put this in the hands of the right people. And you could see that conversation, those wheels start to turn. Is like, we don't all need to be in a meeting for this. I could go look at my data, so-and-so, they could go look at their data, and so everybody could be doing their own individual jobs and functions without having to pull everyone together and try to figure it all out together, only doing that really when it's necessary. And I think because that senior director was also in there, it started really getting the ball moving on how they wanted to do things. And it made those conversations much easier.
Yeah. And at that point, when you're in a meeting like that, you can't stop it from rolling ahead.
Yeah.
Right? So if all of a sudden someone's thinking like, oh no, I don't want people talking about this, it's too late. The conversations have begun and people's eyes are opening, but it was good. It sounds, yeah.
That was exactly it. There was one thing that we found where it was, I really can't say too much about what it was because the data was very sensitive, but which I'm surprised they let me even look at it. But there was one simple graph that showed it was just a bar chart of expenditures, and I just sorted the bar chart, and there was this point where we were looking at it and it was like, oh, that's a thing, like that's a real thing right there, and we need to go look at that. And so everybody's attitude in the room not only changed in like, oh, we're going to go, like, we need to go tackle this, but also like, or we need to start thinking about organizational change. But it was also like like the conversation changed. Like, we need to go figure this thing out. And so it was an automatic, like, procedural organizational benefit that was automatically granted. And I was like, okay, I can't be part of this conversation, but you guys go have fun.
Yeah. Cause now you're getting into not only just developing insights, but it's clicking on what they need to take action on.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So it's not just, oh, this is a pretty bar chart or an ugly bar chart, but like, oh, we're seeing something in there that we know needs to be looked into. Right. We don't know exactly what we're going to write. And then it's becomes something. And if it was something people didn't know about, then the value starts to, jump out right away. You're like, well, we've been working at this for a long time, and now in minutes and only, on something, I'll call it semi-random, right? You weren't really trying to do a complete analysis. You were just going through the motions of showing the software off. So yeah, that's a great story about, maybe how to help those cultural issues along and do it more from a, almost like team exercises in the beginning rather than individual activities. And yeah, I mean, maybe that's a good way. And it helps with communications if people are doing things together in learning some ways like that. So that's an interesting thought about how to introduce some of this stuff rather than completely, we're just doing self-service. And
right.
It's like, I like that idea. So I want to get to, I want to jump into one more thing. I want to dig into your thoughts about, especially working with foundations and doing things in the public arena. So, and this will maybe be a little bit corny, but I know you're a dog lover, and now that we're finally safe to go out and walk again in the real world. So you get out to Central Park, and your dog just starts digging wildly somewhere, which is probably a no, but and uncovers a briefcase. So you're intrigued, and of course you're thinking, I've hit the jackpot. I found some buried treasure, but actually it's the ghost of John Jacob Astor comes out, and he's the guy, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, he was the guy who started the Waldorf Astoria, which I'm sure you've seen. And this guy also died on the Titanic. So that's enough for the history lesson. The important part is today his fortune would be worth a couple $2 billion. And so he says, Nick, thanks for letting me out of the briefcase. And as your reward, I'll give you whatever money you need to start a foundation to help others with data. So I know that's something that, you really want to, that's a personal interest to you. So who would you want to help, and what area would you focus on? Because there's so many things you could do when it comes to, using data with foundations.
Oh boy, you give me a big, broad space to work with. I think first of all, it wouldn't surprise me at all if I was fostering a dog, which is what I do, and they went and started being ill-behaved and digging around. You get dogs in all sorts of states. That's totally normal, totally fine. It's part of the pleasure of fostering, is you get to sort of do some training on them, make sure they don't go tear up someone's yard. So this is a completely plausible story at this point.
Except for maybe the ghost part.
I don't know. Haven't seen one, but haven't not seen one. So I think that in terms of what I see, it goes back to the two things that we've been talking about. Trust, people are smart. And if we think about those two things, people are smart and we should trust them. An organization or a cause that I would love to build toward is looking at different sorts of, let's say, historically oppressed or vulnerable communities and groups, and creating a program that would give them opportunities to learn and use data in a meaningful context. One of the things that we see in New York 14, which can't talk too much about it, is that it has some of the poorest communities in America, and it is full of, to my experience in working with these communities, some of the smartest, most talented people who simply don't have access to some of the resources that you and I have had access to.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to build a program or to build a foundation, it would be to try to focus on those kinds of communities that haven't had those privileges that you and I have been given, and start giving them some of those. And simply, it's not about dumping a bunch of money into a community or saying like, I know what's best for you. It's about giving them the skills to do the things that they already want to do, that they want to be able to do. And
I like that.
And in enabling that, I'm thinking a little bit about the problem of colonialism abroad and at home, right? is like there's the white savior complex, and that's absolutely not something that I would ever want to do. So from my perspective, it would be something where fundamentally I would want to step back. I would want to also have people from those communities running the foundation, to the best of their abilities and telling us what is needed. I am not the person to do that necessarily.
Because they're right. They're into the heart of what's going on, which I think you're right. It does parallel what happens in the for-profit world, that it's the people, a lot of times decisions are made by somebody more senior. It doesn't have to be like a CEO, but, could even just be a manager or a whatever, director. But it's the people who are really doing the work, that are really down, in the trenches per se, that know they know what's going on the best.
Yeah.
And, and a lot of times they really understand the inner workings of the business the best, but aren't given the trust and the ability to follow through, right? It's like, well, what's going on. Why don't you make the decision about something? And it doesn't mean that they should be able to make, necessarily decisions that are changing the course of the company in a big way, for lots of reasons. But there's probably certain decisions that they could make that they're not allowed to make these days. And like you said, coming into an area and saying, I know what's best for you, isn't really feasible, because you're not living there. You're not one of the people who understands what's going on a day-to-day basis. So giving people that ability to do it for themselves. So what, just to kind of close out, what would you think is the biggest challenge to doing that, though? There's lots of challenges, right? Like fundamentally, structurally, as Americans, I think that we often think about things in that sort of paternalistic mode of thought. So like, we don't have to go there too much. So that's a major challenge, right? But I think another one is that this reliance, to some degree, on hoping for angel donors to be able to like not only identify the problem but execute it correctly. So if we think about how do we want to do this, we want to give people the resources, which are fundamentally lacking, right, in a lot of these communities, to create and manage their own futures and destinies. That's it, right? And we fall down so hard on that project so often. And again, going back to data, fundamentally looking at data, trust, people are smart, right? We think about all those three things, then
you want to give that data back to those communities. You want to give those data skills back to those communities, and you want them to be empowered to create and manage their own data resources, to make their own decisions. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, definitely kinds of things that don't happen overnight or in a week or by just teaching in a class, things that probably have to be, experienced in real life and taught over time. And just like any other skill, I think sometimes people think things around data are just going to happen. I'll throw you in a class for a couple of days and
right, or just throw money at a problem, right?
Or just throw, that almost never seems to work in anything you do. So, well, I think that just to kind of close up, I think we hit on a couple of really big ideas that are coming to the forefront these days. You talk about trust and communication. I think are huge. You hear talk things like data culture, and I think those ideas fall all together. And we all know cultural issues are some of the toughest to tackle. And I think it's great that people are saying it. I think there's a lot of work ahead for us to really dive in and really understand what it means to say things like that, and not just make it kind of a loose buzzword that that maybe people throw money at, but don't really have a solution. So hopefully we'll see some progress, and we'll talk again about this and see where things have gone. So Nick, thanks again so much for joining us today. Really some great ideas and discussions that maybe will instigate people to have at their own workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope so too. This is like really interesting stuff.
Yeah,
to me at least.
It's deep for sure. So, my friend, thank you. Stay safe, and everybody, see you soon again on Analytic Stories.